Let's start now. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this high-level working breakfast on climate science education, the role of scholastic frameworks and education in reaching Europe's climate goal. I have a little bit of an echo. Maybe. And my name is David Osimo. I know most of you. I will be your moderator for this hour. Now, the background of this meeting is that we all know that the transition to the net zero economy will require behavioral change by all citizens. And young people play a particularly important role because they can take action now and in the future, but also because they can be ambassador of change for friends and family. And education in this sense plays a major role. I was reading the OECD PISA report of 2006 and on precisely on sustainability, and it wrote, the challenge for education, it's not just to produce more and better trained environmental scientists, but also to provide for informed and motivated citizens that will understand and interpret sophisticated scientific theory and evidence and act upon this knowledge. And I think this quote is still very valuable to orient our work. And this is actually why the European Green Deal, among many different measures cutting across all sectors of the economy, includes a dedicated action on climate science education, even though the European Union has almost no competence on education. The European Commission concretely envisages the creation, the testing, and the deployment of a competence framework. And today we have a consortium represented in this meeting with the Lisbon Council, European Schoolnet, the International Consortium of Research Staff Associations, Public Policy and Management Institute, and the European Sustainable Energy Innovation Alliance, and the National Institute for Documentation, Innovation, and Educational Research in Dia from Italy. Now, today we have a meeting of a mixed team of high-level global experts and scientists, which in perspective could become the formal advisory board of the project once started. And we have an exceptional mix of expertise on science policy, on climate change and education from both the public and the private sector. So today we're going to discuss a very simple concept. How can we make this competence framework a success for delivering the European Green Deal? How can we design it? How can we deploy it at large scale? Today, the discussion will be kicked off by Sir Peter Gluckman, the director of COI2, University of Auckland, president-elect of the International Science Council and former chief science advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And we will, after Sir Peter Gluckman, open the intervention to to the expert members of the advisory panel, such as Cornelis Bloch, professor at Delft University of Technology and one of the lead authors of the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Xavier Prats-Monnet, the former Director General for Education at the European Commission and board member at Teach for All, Andrea Schleicher, Director Education and Skills and Special Advisor on Education Policy to the Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and Harry Ferrar, Europe Chair of the Corporate Leaders Group and Head of the Global Public and Government Affairs of Signify. We also have acceptance from Anne Mettler, Europe Director at Gate Venture, and Marion Fertet, the EU Affairs Managers at Airbus, but they couldn't be with us this morning. This session will be on the record, and if you agree, the recording will be posted next year on the Lisbon Council website. In the meantime, and without further hesitation, I would like to give the floor to Sir Peter Gluckman for any introductory remarks to kick off the discussion.
Thanks very much, and it's good to see a number of old friends, and I enjoy working with the Lisbon Council. I will start my provocation asking the question, what are we really trying to achieve through consideration of the role of education in this competency framework? I can see at least 4 overlapping answers to this question, and I think if we think about that, that informs how a competency strategy could be developed. The first is It's a way to gain societal consensus over some very difficult trade-offs and decisions that will be needed to be made over coming years that will impact on every European citizen's way of life. Secondly, as has already been said by David, it should empower and insist the behavioural changes that will be required. But thirdly, and I think quite importantly, it's about sustaining or enhancing or regaining the social cohesion that will be needed in the face of growing existential risks created by climate change and the parallel pressures created by climate change, associated with climate change, geostrategic, social, technological, economic, and demographic change. Political action over climate change will not occur in isolation from these dynamics, and in turn could add to the mindsets of confusion, blame, anger, and loss of trust that rapid and threatening change often brings. And I think education to promote social cohesion will be very important. And fourthly, protecting citizens' psychological resilience and mental health in the face of changes of the challenges ahead arising from both from the externalities of rapid change and from the societal decisions and changes in behaviour that will be needed. And this question is being posed in an environment where technologies have empowered misinformation and disinformation, especially around climate change, and where the future of technology may on one hand enhance risks and at the same time be core to solutions. Parenthetically, there are many paradoxes. We talk about the global commons, yet the multinational system is not in good shape. Inequality grows, environmental degradation continues, and trust in governments is generally under threat. You're asking a lot of education to change all that until governments take actions and behave in ways that regain trust from its citizens and promote social cohesion. To expect too much of education may be unrealistic. But that aside, let's focus on formal and informal education and how they could advance the climate change agenda. First, let's deal with the easiest question, defining what not to do. We must not think of this primarily as an issue of inadequate science education and take a deficit approach. Deficit approaches don't work. Indeed, I'm worried that the terminology itself is implying that they're framing the problem as a deficit issue. That's not to say science education, at least science literacy, is not critical, and I'll return to that. But I think there are more fundamental needs to focus on first in both formal and informal education. Andreas knows this better than I do. Executive function, literacy, and critical thinking are the three most important skills that we need to focus education on. And all three are critical to this challenge of climate change. Executive function of the brain's foundation for healthy development and cooperation. Non-cognitive executive functions are essential to efficiency in learning and performance, successful social interactions, and most importantly, developing psychological resilience to cope with rapid change. We all know that executive function depends on the quality of early childhood and early year education, yet education in general does not focus upon it. In a world where facts come from the internet rather than from memory, the problem is whose facts are real. We talk a lot about critical thinking and teaching it, but frankly, we do it rather randomly. New modes of teaching will be needed to be effective, both in childhood and adolescence and in adult learning. There are exciting new modalities being tested using intelligent computer systems. But again, we need to embed these new techniques across the curriculum rather than seeing them as unusual separate modules of learning. Literacy remains a challenge. Even in advanced countries, functional literacy is less than what many might think, especially for those with intergenerational disadvantage. They might be able to read the words, but do the underlying concepts reach through? And literacy now must be a concept that extends beyond reading and numbers. It must include civic, social, and science literacy, and in this context, it also means environmental literacy. I do not mean that every potential citizen needs to know the second law of thermodynamics. What they need to know is how science works, how scientific methods allow us to work out what is most likely to be real and what is not. This is where science education needs to go, rather than teaching lots of boring, isolated factoids which are not relevant. All children need that basic understanding of how science works, of how we come to understand the world and what is happening. And the environment and nature are, of course, areas where examples can be derived to inform all forms of literacy and support critical thinking. These are the three basics that have a critical role to play in dealing with a complex changing world. But now I want to come to the context of the warming planet and its implications for secondary and adult education. The Sustainable Development Goals as a generalisation mean very little to most citizens and indeed to many policymakers. Why? In part because they artificially divide our future into 17 distinct goals. But we all know that they're not distinct. Climate change, that is goal 13, cannot be separated from 5 other environmental goals, from the social goals, from the economic goals, and from the individual goals affecting individuals. What we are talking about is explaining interrelationships, connections, and systems thinking. This means starting to think and teach in transdisciplinary terms. Citizens are not dumb. Inherently, they know that things are complex, and there's no free lunch, even though politicians often try to sell them the silver bullet. We need to teach in ways that reflect reality. How we do so may take time to develop the effective pedagogical approaches, but problem-based learning is one methodology especially used in medical education, and there's much to learn from the emergence of future studies and transdisciplinarity. Indeed, a greater focus on anticipatory framing can be a very valuable tool in education. Increasingly, young people want their education to feel relevant to them. Education needs to shift, in many countries, needs to shift its curriculum content to be more relevant. While disciplinary knowledge is essential, the examples used can be much more relevant. For example, building mathematical models of some aspects of the climate change may be a far more useful way of teaching mathematics and physics rather than abstract calculus and theoretical examples. The issues in climate competency are much more than just environmental science. And while in context it may be an appropriate subject, there are many other ways in which the above concepts can be transmitted. Systems teaching leads to the core issue that addressing climate competency needs, understanding trade-offs. We need to teach and talk honestly about trade-offs, and that's not possible without significant changes in education towards a systems-based approach. I haven't talked much about misinformation and disinformation. We all assume that critical thinking is the critical educational defence. But it may be, but we have to learn much about defining strategies to use, and new issues will emerge. Social cohesion and trust in the scientific and policy leadership may be the best defence. In my mind, it makes the combination of executive function, critical thinking, and multiple literacies more urgent. Finally, I want to focus on self-discovery and the principles of co-production of understanding. Citizen science is but one component. There are many other tools. For example, computer-based energy models which individual citizens can play with to explore decision-making options can be used. The UK Ministry, the Department of Energy and Climate Change developed a very effective and valuable energy calculator that engaged citizens in issues of what choices should be made with respect to energy sources. I think there's enormous potential in such approaches. Co-design and co-production are much more effective with both adult and youth learners than deficit approaches. I've hardly focused on the details of climate change because it's not the details of the science that matters beyond some very basic concepts. In the end, what I'm suggesting requires some rethinking of the nature of formal education and informal education, how governments talk to their citizens, how organisations are more honest about issues and trade-offs, how citizens are consulted, and how options are put forward. Ultimately, Europe will need a team of 5 100 million people buying into collective decision-making processes with collective understandings. The education system can be a critical part of this, but I think more than incremental change will be needed, and there are some great educational scientists on this call, and I think their inputs will be essential. Thanks, David.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much for this great introduction. We couldn't have hoped for a better start. And I think we will all get back to the recording to capture all the many ideas that were raised. Now, I would like to open the floor to the members, to the experts participating here. I don't know who wants to start, but of course, Andreas comes to mind in view of the many hints that Peter Gluckman has raised. Andreas, would you like to start with your first reaction? Unmute. You're muted still.
Now it should work. Can you hear me? Good. Thank you. This is, I think, one of the questions of our times, how we can make people more scientifically, environmentally literate and also responsible. When we tested that in PISA, we found one thing. We looked at many predictors of environmental behavior, and the only one that was actually robust was actually the science of it, whether students could think like a scientist. That was we looked at lots of attitudes, lots of expectations. Basically, what we found were students lacked the epistemic understanding of science. The principles, the understanding of the principles of science. They had a great deal of scientific environmental optimism. Basically, they said, well, politicians are going to solve this. I don't have to do anything about this myself. Where students had figured out the science of it and could, think like a scientist, they had a much more realistic appreciation of the magnitude of the challenge. And we're also, interestingly, more willing to engage with this. So I think that's a very important point. And I don't sort of, I see the, I think it's also about, multiple literacies, executive functions, absolutely. But we should not underestimate the basic understanding that young people need about the science that underpins this. And not the scientific knowledge, but the scientific understanding. Second point, I want to also emphasize that Peter made, if you think about only 1 in 10 15-year-olds in the OECD area, the most privileged countries, being able to distinguish fact from opinion when things become complicated, now 9%, then you can understand why people have such a hard time to deal with a complex field like this, where you need to actually navigate a lot of complex and contested territory. So I think that's the other part, the capacity to manage fact and opinion. But I think there's more to this. The biggest question underpinning all of this is the capacity of citizens to balance the present with the future. Those are the choices that we have to make as individuals and that we have to make it as nations. And I don't think we do very much in our education systems on that front. Basically, it's all about, value frameworks. I extract anything that I can do today rather than, I'm going to think about tomorrow. And this is a behavioral component where people need to learn to take responsibility for the future, and we do that not just with the environment around climate, we do the same thing, on many other dimensions. And I think this is the harder part to teach, because that's probably not taught but caught in terms of the environments in which you are. But I think that's a big part of this dilemma. How do we actually give young people more agency and make them, use that agency? The reason I'm saying this, because in 2018, when we looked at global competency, actually you have about 8 out of 10 young people in the OECD world, and in many countries more, who actually take this very serious. They say, climate change is one of the biggest kind of questions of our times. Many of them even say, I can explain those basic principles to, my grandparents. Sort of, they feel that they actually, have a quite good enough understanding of those ideas. But when you ask them, can you do something about it? It's very, very limited set of agency, and I think that's what we need to work on, to give young people more room to experiment, to try things out, to take responsibility. It's all very abstract. We teach sort of content, but we do not deliver that kind of agency. At least that came out of our assessment of global competency. So in a nutshell, I think it's really about the science of it, the scientific understanding. It's really about the capacity of people to navigate, complex information, navigate ambiguity, manage uncertainty, and then, having that agency to make good choices between today and tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I would like now to move to the how and involve Xavier in the conversation. If we think of, we are asking a lot from the education system. How can we do that? How can we achieve, more than anyone, the map of the education landscape of Europe?
Yeah, thanks a lot, and good morning to everybody. This has been two great comments already. I should say that I'm a bit less worried about the capacity of children to learn about this than the capacity of teachers to teach it. Because we are, I think, expressing a lot of things about how education should change. But I think that children are usually much more capable of accepting this than teachers are capable to have the tools to do all this. And I would say that if we have to focus on something, one thing I would definitely not forget is how we give the educators, school principals, teachers, the tools, the incentives, the support, the training to actually be able to change these paradigms of teaching. If we don't do that, I think it will be very difficult to introduce the sort of, paradigm changes that Peter Gluckman and Andreas were mentioning. And I think that here we have a very serious challenge, partly because many teachers are actually the grandparents that Andreas was mentioning. If you look at the age of teachers in most OECD countries, and definitely in the EU, the average age is, in many cases, above 50. And that, does give you a good sense of the capacity of people to adapt and change. And secondly, we have, especially in continental Europe and especially in southern continental Europe, very sclerotic education systems that provide precious little incentives, feedback, motivation, etc. to educators. So one aspect I will look into is how can we make sure that we address the needs and the support that educators will need to introduce the kind of more comprehensive and sophisticated way of learning that we need.
Thank you very much. Of course, education is important. Sorry.
Excuse me, may I just hold on just one very small point. One thing also not to forget in my experience as a, let's say, a technocrat, is the lack of habit, the resistance, and sometimes even the the reluctance of different government departments to actually speak with each other. And addressing climate change from an education point of view implies a level of cooperation between ministries of education and ministries of environment, other departments, that is completely unprecedented. And this will have to be looked at in different ways. So another, let's say, challenge I would introduce is how can we provide the right incentives for a more transversal look at issues than is currently the case. Sorry for this.
No, thank you. That's very important. And you pointed out we need to enhance cooperation across government. But of course, if we want to deliver the goals of the European Green Deal, we need to go even more to reach out even more, and companies plays a fundamental role into this. Not just because they are a large carbon emitter, but in their innovation is today heavily linked to the capacity to develop new technology and to deploy them at scale. And I think Signify has a particular role, and in general, the corporate leaders group, and obviously I'm looking at Harry here, have a very important role in this, not just as the demand side of education, but also as contributor of how to improve our education system, including lifelong learning. So, Harry, how do you see this from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you, David. Now, first of all, personally, I believe that change can certainly happen, not by micromanaging, but by setting long-term goals, mobilizing communities and people. That is also what we've done at Signify, and then New Name for Lighting. I think you know that. So in the past, we've done so. And actually, when I first worked with Paul, then we set a target for the global lighting market transition. We were the global market leader in the legacy technology, and actually in 2006 we called for the phase out of incandescent light bulbs, which was both symbolic, but it was also still 2/3 of our sales volume. And actually implicitly we called for the global phase out of all of our products. And because we've done that, then we made this a race to the future, in this case also to our future, while contributing to climate mitigation. I think today we see that we're one of the few legacy players that's left, and there were some really big ones that are now quite in shatters, not the least the GE Lighting. So in that sense, then when you mobilize people, they start seeing again that change is aspirational. So I really liked the comments that Peter, Andreas, and Javier made, because we need to educate both the right side and the left side of the brain. So we can look at a lot of technology, rational things, the economics, the paybacks, and so forth. But then, I think that the other side, I think that's the left side of the brain. Then, let's say the emotional side, the psychology, the buy-in, making things tangible. I think it's crucially important, and that is also what we see here where populists call upon people's sense of uncertainty, lack of belonging, lack of inclusiveness, and then they try to sell a better future by telling them that we should stick to being in yesterday. And of course that doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, then they don't take the blame. They would say the swamp has been deeper than we told you, so et cetera, et cetera. And this further feeds into populism. So I believe there, let's say the psychology of change, and maybe summarizing it like that, is also a very important area to educate, to make future challenges real, to show the benefits, to make them tangible. 5 years ago, we took on a commitment to become carbon neutral in 2020, so which we became in last September. So we're now a carbon neutral company. And we see there that this is hugely engaging for all employees, but also in the outside world. Next to that, there's one angle that I would like to add to this briefly. And that is when we move to a carbon neutral future, it's not only the type of education that we need, but also there's something really important about the quantity of people with certain skills that we need. And we know that, more or less summarized, we need to double our efforts. We need to double our efforts on climate. We need to double our efforts on almost every SDG. And if you now see also with Europe's carbon neutral goal, the most important part is mitigation. So doubling the rate of energy of, let's say, of infrastructure renovation linked to the 55% 2030 greenhouse gas reduction target means that we need to more than double renovation rates of infrastructure. But this also means, and I think we know that argument, that this is going to create a lot of jobs. But that means that we need to model, if we are going to double infrastructure renovation rates, how many people do we need? What kind of STEM education do they need to have? What kind of high-tech skills? What kind of low-medium skills? How many installers? How many designers have we seen in the past after the financial crisis, when the economy started picking up again, that immediately we had a shortage in labor in the construction sector. So what I'm saying, if we then model also the number of students at all these levels that we need, and we can also involve the ministers of education from this angle, so that we also timely educate the people that we need to make this transition. Because otherwise we are debating and arguing how to make this happen, but then at the moment everybody says, yes, we go for it. We elect the people to do it, which in itself would backfire. So maybe in shorthand, psychology of change, the left and the right side of the brain. Let's educate both, but let's also look at the quantitative requirements by modeling what we need to go through this transition. Because once we set it in motion, and once we create more examples that are tangible, and let's say brighter schools, more comfortable ambience at home, more productive working environments. We see also with connected lighting, less traffic accidents, less street crime. So then when those examples start to be known more broadly, then I think we can also create a broader support in voting and buying behavior of people to support this. But then we need the people, to push this agenda forward. So I'll leave it there, David.
Wow, thank you. I think it's time now. We have looked at different societal dimension, but if we involve Professor Block, we can have a better sense of looking at the science, at the frontier, and how you see, from your perspective, from your unique perspective, that we can bring basically 500 million people on board, or actually 6 billion in the long term.
Yeah. No, it's indeed one of the big concerns that I have now looking back, back to Paris and ahead to the Conference of the Party next year. We saw after Paris quite some euphoria, and that was to a large extent justified. But the big point is, how do we deliver on commitments? And how do we not also make big promises, which is good, which is where everything starts with. It starts with ambition, but in the end it needs to be done. And I think the European Union has a fairly good track record in delivering on commitments, but you see a lot of countries are struggling with that. And who you even more see struggling is what since Paris is called the non-state actors, say the role of companies and municipalities that also have a lot of commitment, but find it hard to deliver. And for example, we did an investigation of 20 municipalities in the Netherlands, and they all had ambitious climate targets. They want to be climate neutral in 2030 or 2040. And they all have a plan, but if you really dive into that, there was, with one exception, none of these plans could be called a plan. It didn't have concrete actions, or it didn't have an analysis of whether the actions would deliver on towards their commitment. So you see struggling all over the place. And I think it is, all this action is important. The late Nobel Prize winner of economics, Elinor Ostrom, she called that polycentric governance. That's the situation that we are in now. We are, it's not only national governments, but also companies, municipalities, regions, all kinds of non-governmental organizations that play a role in climate action. And that's a huge universe of organizations that has to deal with climate change. And I think that's one of the big challenges. Companies like Signify, they are well equipped, and companies like IKEA, and there are many others that know what to do. But there are also thousands and thousands of companies and municipalities and others that find it difficult to turn their ambition into action. And I think that's also one of the big challenges that we have. Of course, it's also linked to my university. I'm with Delft University of Technology, which is, of course, more, it's about what can we do, how can we deliver it. So that's particularly our contribution. I myself am going to develop a series of MOOCs next year on this particular topic. How do we translate ambition into action? And that is, but I think that's in general an important thing that we need to get a work of. We'll do that at the academic level, but we recognize, there is much more to do than just this. But one point I want to add, in addition to all the other things that were already made.
Thank you very much. And I think this contrast with this ambition and action is very important also for the project we are working on. I mean, we have to deliver something and deploy it at scale and achieve an impact. And it's crucial that we keep in mind these trade-offs also in the case of our project. Mark, from the perspective of schools, I mean, you know the context better than anyone, how things are actually going in the schools and how change can be promoted. How do you see where do you see the low-hanging fruits and the things to be done first to help turning ambition into action?
Thank you very much, and I really do appreciate the previous intervention. And for me, I would start from the first question. and that's linked to the international studies, and that's linked to the STEM attractiveness globally, because we have to start from that particular challenge we all face in our European education system. And we have to question how to make our STEM studies more attractive. And at the level of European SchoolNet, we identified through our various projects we run for more than 15 years now, that there are 3 interrelated factors. The first one is to get motivated and recognized teachers. And it's linked to both pre-service and in-service training of teachers. And I'd like to correlate that with what Xavier just said regarding the necessity to provide teachers with new content, new tools, new pedagogical approaches. So the capacity of teachers to teach is much more important than the capacity of students to learn, because we can trust students, but the preparation of teachers is really, really important. The second factor is to develop innovative pedagogy and creative curriculum. And it has been mentioned by Peter in the introduction speech, we have to embed any actions in the curriculum. And for that, we will have to work globally at European level to identify and promote examples of good practices with a perspective on transferability. And the third aspect for the attractiveness is the role and engagement of industry. And that's important to not only look at what type of competence are needed, it is important also to go beyond, to look at what the future green jobs will be, importance of role models, and also to provide better information to teachers on what already exists, on what industry offers, and more particularly, not to forget the roles that guidance counselors can play. So that's my first type of comments. I would like to move very quickly on. The second challenge is that high STEM performance in a country does not lead necessarily to a higher level of interest from students. So which means we also have to keep in mind the motivation and the interest and how we measure that. And from time to time, when we look at the results of PISA, but we are not as skilled as Andreas on that, from time to time, we can see, if we analyze in detail some data, that the country which has the best results in STEM disciplines are not necessarily the country where the students have the highest interest. And that's certainly some elements which is important to take in mind. And my last comment is concerning the projects we are working on. I really think one of the challenges we have is to go and to move to an integrated approach. And we have to go beyond the classic disciplines. Within industry, we speak about STEM competencies, but there is no STEM teachers in schools. You have a life science teachers, you have a math teacher, you have a chemical teacher, and the challenge on this environmental project is to go beyond individual disciplines, to go and to really be sure that we can provide a proper framework where teachers can develop and to give priority to integrated STEM approaches rather than discipline by discipline. It's absolutely essential that we can promote all those type of elements. And the last element that it was mentioned by Peter in introductory element, it is essential that we can bring research results on climate change and sustainability accessible to schools and teachers. And is linked to the information and disinformation. Schools should also be part of research projects in this area via citizen science approach. So we absolutely have to bring back the research into the education development. So that's my small contribution for now.
Well, not so small. Listen, we have 20 minutes left, so we don't want to take more time than we promised. And we're now moving towards the conclusions. I would like to, first of all, ask the experts, to prepare some last thoughts that they want to leave us with. But before we move into that, I would like to open up a little bit the discussion to all partners and to all people present here for any consideration and question. and particularly thinking about the operationalization of this. I mean, this is just early stage, but we need also some concrete inspiring guidelines and examples. So thinking of who got it right in this field, some interesting example that we can take as inspiration. And I'm thinking, for instance, of the Finnish experiment on fighting misinformation as an example. So first, let me open the floor to anyone who wants to intervene, and then we will go back to the expert for the final conclusion. Paul, the floor is yours.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, David. And let me just, while I have the floor, briefly thank everyone for joining this call. I know how busy everyone is, and we really appreciate the time you take to this, to give to this subject and to this project. And I think it's because we all share very high hopes for it. I'll make a very brief comment. This has been a fascinating discussion, and we have some amazing change agents on this call. Harry, of course, what you described at Signify is amazing, and Cornelis, your work over the years has been astonishing too. I don't say that to flatter either of you, but what I really wanted to mention briefly was Andreas, because I think the most successful project I have ever seen of driving change was the PISA project, and we might take a brief moment to reflect on that. What PISA did to drive change was find a way to measure something. I mean, we had a lot of sort of ideas and comments about what was and wasn't working in education. What we didn't have was a very good way of testing it. And you brought that along, and the learnings that came from it were immense. So I guess what I'm saying is my own personal contribution, this is a contribution, not a decision. Others will be deciding where to go on this. I'm in a passenger seat and not a leader seat in this discussion. But it would be that we take some insight from the management consultants and try to find a way of measuring competences in these areas so we can see how well we are doing, but also so we can see how well we're doing at actually getting key messages across, not just having nice discussions about it, but delivering the kind of competences that this project is meant to address in an educational format. I think we'll need to find some way of measuring it to track progress. That was what I wanted to say. And thanks to you all.
Thank you very much, Paul. And indeed, one of the components we are looking at is precisely assessing the assessment framework of this, the assessment side of this competence framework. Anyone else wants to chip in?
Actually, I'd like to say a few things. Hi, I'd like to go back a little bit to the why question, the fundamental idea of a shared vision we have about Europe and a shared value system, because it's I think a lot of people talk about the Green Deal, and I really I'm not sure whether people really know what is behind. So what are we really sharing? A common value system and a common European narrative. So for me, this is a fundamental thought about, and it will be needed to define this common value framework to actually mobilize people more generally. I think the young people are mobilized, but they need to be guided into action. And I think education has a very important role to play to help the young people along to actually deliver climate-friendly solutions. And the ECF, in my mind, needs to respond to this common value creation in Europe. So it's a more fundamental thing. It's about European education as a whole, and that is at stake, in my view, defining the narrative for the next centuries. So this is one aspect I wanted to bring along. The second is that I also think, in addition to the young people, we need to focus on people who are really remote from education, who don't have access to education the way they should have, and try to mobilize them as well, because it needs to. It's as was said before, we need to engage larger groups of society. It's very important. And in terms of the how, we have, as an association, we have a lot of actually good experience with focusing on solutions and inquiry-based learning. I think it's important to address the complexity of systems and to help local climate communities to come along with their solutions. So it's really focusing on solutions that will help us, will also involve the larger part of the stakeholders into action. So it's a multi-actor activity that needs to be in our minds when we design the framework. And in terms of best practice cases, I'd like to mention a few. One is that we organize student camps, interdisciplinary student camps, together with companies, where we guide them to address challenges owned by different stakeholder groups. For example, the challenge of how to reach climate protection targets to address this challenge that the governments have, by student groups together, guided with by their teachers, or for example, to design a biomass campaign of use of biomass together with the agricultural chambers, or to come up with a biocircular economy strategy for a specific region, or to design a bio-waste products for waste system for a government. So there are lots of experiences we have there, but this is complex solution creation with a complex, partnership of actors across the sectors, and that is something that is been really rewarding to see that it's possible. And I think, but essentially it requires to ask the question, why do we do this, and what do we what is our European narrative to achieve all this? So this is an important question. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We have 10 minutes left. I would like to circle back to the expert, maybe in the same order as we had them in the beginning. So, Peter, what do you take out of this conversation? I mean, we take out a lot, so thank you very much. But what do you take out on your side?
I think there's an enormous coherency in the conversation. I see, although people have emphasized different bits, it fits together in like a jigsaw. I think there's a lot there to say. I would like to just add one more element, and it's been alluded to by several of you. Earlier this year, the OECD produced a very important report addressing societal challenges using transdisciplinary research. And I would add the words "ed education," because the report actually talks about education as well. And I think we've all talked about the fact that we've got to find relevancy for the students of any age, the fact that somehow, and I think it's a particular challenge in higher education, to balance disciplinary depth against the need for transdisciplinary approaches. The point the OECD is making in that report is to address societal challenges, you need to bring multiple disciplines together, and you need to involve the stakeholders. Now, I think you can apply the same principles into the education system, and a number of you have talked about that. There are a number of aspects where I think that it leads to it. It leads to thinking about systems thinking, it leads to critical thinking, and there are some fantastic new tools being developed in both the public and private sector for teaching these things. And I think we need to start realizing that schools are going to have to buy them into their systems. In New Zealand, the best schools are already doing so. And then finally, I still think co-design and co-participation remain the best ways of learning. And a good example of that is the GLOBE program by NASA, which involves astronauts globally working with countries, particularly in the developing world, to teach environmental science. And I think there are many ways it can be done, but I think we need to involve the citizens in this question? Stakeholder engagement.
Thank you very much. Wow, sorry, there's some echo. Andreas?
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to underline Paul's point. I really think, measurement to build awareness and track progress is really important. I also think it's doable. This is something that can be done. It can be done well. I think when it comes to education, the focus, and it comes very clearly through this conversation, to strengthen student agency. I think that's really, and that means also that the place of learning of environmental issues, climate, is not the classroom only, but it's really, I think, a lot of places of learning. I think that's something I think is going to be very important. And last but not least, I think very much like Peter also, we should resist the temptation to, make out of every issue a new school subject. This is about, helping young people to think across the boundaries of disciplines and see responsibility. And I think to conceptualize this as a kind of multidisciplinary approach, I think is going to be very important.
Thank you.
Okay. So.
Indeed. Jessica, you wanted to say something.
Thank you to all of you for your intervention. It was really great to hear and great to listen. And totally agree with every one of you, because it's impossible not to agree. But when David asked, okay, there are any best cases, so let's look to Finland, what they're doing right. It was for me, okay, but I'm working for the Italian Ministry of Education, and we're working very close with schools and teachers, and we're trying new methodologies and new technologies in class. And we're also involved in teacher training, and the teachers, they left university and have to go to school and start their first year. So very close to the students and the teachers, what's happening in school. And it's only a thought, because I think we don't have to think too big, because if we, for sure, every day when I look at my children and they have to go to school, I think, okay, it's a mess. We have to change the whole education system. We have to rebuild it from the scratch, because like this is it's not working. They're not happy to learn. They're mostly annoyed. They're just throwing away 8 hours, 6 hours of the day away, forgetting most of all the next day what they have done in school. So, but I think to have success and to measure if this project for the assessment could be successful, maybe we have to start a little bit lower and concentrate on the school and the teachers. And it's right, the kids have to be involved, and it has to be also emotional. It's very important. Without emotion, they have no motivation. But I think we're forgetting about the head teacher of the school. It's a very important element, because even if you have motivated teachers and you're giving the teacher the right tool and the right support and the right methodology, it will be still one teacher, and it's very hard just to make a change at school if only one teacher wanted to change. And to change the school all the way, we need the support of the head teacher. And and it's a leadership. And I think we don't have to forget about that.
Thank you, Jessica. That's a very important point that we have to keep in mind. So 5 minutes left, last 3 interventions. I will get back to the expert and members of the Embryonic Advisory Board. Xavier Prats, what's your view?
Thank you. I can be very brief. I think picking up on what both Andreas and Peter said about not trying to invent a new subject every time in schools, I think we don't need to invent new subjects, but I think the implication of the discussion is that we have to look at a different way in which education institutions look at their relationship with society. I think that schools and their stakeholders are not used to thinking about themselves as agents of change for society. And higher education institutions, at least since Auckland, and that's 210 years ago, have been used to thinking of themselves as places of education and research, looking at excellence as defined by peers. I think that a far stronger involvement between education institutions and society is indispensable to get to our agenda. And this requires a change of mindset, not change of subjects that are being taught, but a different way of looking at the relationship between education and the rest of society. And in terms of concepts to use, I think that perhaps the characteristic might be looking at also for measuring in the framework of PISA, for example, is leadership, because this is perhaps the thing that brings together all the different actors that have to put in place to deliver on the kind of change we are discussing.
Thank you very much. Harry, your last words?
Yes, I had something else in mind, but I will share, because of time, I will share just one observation. So there's one item that I actually find really intriguing, and that is, I think all of us on the call, and we've had to pass some sort of exam or qualification for the roles that we have. And intriguingly, our political leaders don't have to pass any exam or don't have to have any education for the positions that they have. And we see then that some politicians, they are well qualified, so they guide us. Others are not, and they try to misguide us. And even immigrants in the Netherlands, and I think in many countries, they have to pass a citizenship exam, and so that everybody sees that they qualify on language, on culture, and whatever, so that they can integrate. So one thought that I'd like to leave with you, and it's a challenging one, is in how far could we also look at how do we improve education of those that will be our political leaders at any level, so national but also local level. You see the same issues playing.
Harry, that may be the most seditious intervention in the history of the Lisbon Council, but thank you for that.
Cornelis, would you like to?
What could I add? So many things have been told this last hour, and it just shows how multifaceted this issue of climate and science education is. So I'd leave it with that, and thanks for inviting me and organizing this meeting.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for your time. It has been invaluable to listen to you. I cannot absolutely in any way summarize what has been said. And to be honest, we don't need to put it all in a box. I think what we are looking for here now is inspiration, and throughout the next years. And we've got plenty of inspiration and reframing of our thinking about the problem. And this is exactly what we need. I hope that this is just the beginning of several meetings, and please feel free to send any additional contribution. Harry, you mentioned there were other things you wanted to say. Please send over via email. We fully appreciate it. And that's all. And I'm glad that this pandemic has limited us in many ways for meeting, but it's also allowed us to bring together such a diverse and high-level panel of people that will be maybe more difficult to convene in person in Brussels. So thank you very much. Have a good day, and hope to see you soon in person.
Thank you very much, Dan. Have a nice day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.